to the Virtually Speaking podcast. My name is Pete Fletcher, and joining me as usual is my good friend, Mr. John Nicholson. John, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Pete. I've new year, new house, trying to get the networking working end to end, and I'm just forgetting how bad I am at terminating cable. I'm like, I've got the newest Wi-Fi 7, and I'm like, wait, why is this maxing out at 100 meg? Like, why do I see fast Ethernet in the logs for negotiation? What's going on here? So I'm trying to just level set, get my network in shape for the new year, and make sure I can fully utilize my 8 gig internet connection.
Absolutely, because I do know it's a new year, new house for you, right? You just moved to Austin, correct?
Yeah, barbecue better, Mexican food very questionable. So,
also, I think there were a couple of new purchases in this house. I see for those watching the video of this, John got a new monitor for his desk.
Yeah, and I also think I'm going to need one of those new NVIDIA 5090s to properly drive this thing. Notice the ratio of money spent on the monitor versus the folding table from Walmart. That's the optimal ratio of of capital budget allocation for your desk.
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful monitor. I'm glad you're in Austin. And like you said, man, it is a new year. It is a time to make sure that your house network, but also maybe even your office network is up to snuff, especially if you're preparing for VCF. We thought we'd kick off the year. A lot of folks are moving to VCF. There's a lot of considerations as it pertains to everything, but certainly from a networking perspective. We were having some of these conversations offline with some of our good friends, and we thought, hey, let's bring them on the topic. Let's bring them on the podcast for a top of the year episode so everybody understands what these guys do around networking. Let's start with our good friend, Mr. Kyle Gleed. Kyle, welcome to Virtually Speaking again.
Hi, Pete. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, man, always a pleasure having you. We definitely want to dive into some of the updates in VCF and some basic network preparation, but also joining the podcast from our support division is Broc Yanda. Broc, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be here.
Yeah, Broc, you definitely, it's always fun talking to you because we work in technical marketing and we see how these products work. And we talk to customers about, hey, this is going to be really great when you get to use these functions. But then you're on the other end of it when they're like, I'm using these functions and this is where I'm at. And then you really get stuck in the trenches. I don't think it's a glorious role, but I'm sure it's a lot of fun. keeps you busy, right?
Yeah, I definitely, most customers don't call me on their best days.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, why don't we start before we dive too deep? Because I know with John, with the firepower that we have on this episode, we could probably get pretty deep pretty quick. But before we do, let's do a quick level set. I want to talk a little bit about network preparation for VMware Cloud Foundation. What do we need to do at a high level? I'd love to, maybe Kyle, we could start with you. Broc, get your opinions as well. What do customers need to be considering when it pertains to preparing their network for VCF?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the typical things. We are just under VCF. We're just running vSphere. So you're going to need to have a management network. You're going to need to have a vMotion network, a vSAN network. Usually, where some of the questions start to come from customers is with Cloud Foundation. Of course, NSX is a required component, and that comes with additional requirements. And so when we're talking about software-defined networking, it doesn't negate the fact that we still have a physical network and we have some requirements on that physical network as well. We need to have a number of VLANs. Typically we have a VLAN for the management, the vMotion, the vSAN, and then we'll have another VLAN for the host TEP network. The TEP is the tunnel endpoint. That's essentially how your NSX is going to talk in and out of the host. And then usually within the NSX, you also want to deploy some what we call NSX edge clusters. And those come with a couple more VLAN requirements for uplinks. Typically you want to have 2 of those for redundancy. The edge, what we call edge clusters in NSX kind of provide that north-south routing as well as a lot of other services. So before deploying Cloud Foundation, you need to make sure that you understand from a physical networking topology, what are the VLAN requirements? And then also when you're looking at those VLAN requirements, remember with virtual networking, you're going to be doing overlays. So you're going to look at your MTUs and make sure that at least on those overlay networks, you have an MTU greater than the default of 1500. Most people nowadays are running jumbo frames and things pretty much just default to 9,000. And if you're in that group, great. But a lot of times, Broc can attest to this, when people get started with Cloud Foundation and you get started with a virtual networking, and you troubleshoot those, it comes down to an MTU mismatch somewhere in the physical network. So you want to pay attention to your MTU settings. So we talked about VLANs, we talked about MTU. The other thing is when you start getting into a private cloud topology with like VMware Cloud Foundation, and just kind of adopting that cloud model where suddenly you're going to have networks popping up, networks going away. How do you maintain those routing tables in this dynamic environment? So we typically recommend you have something like BGP on your network as well. So there's a lot that goes into it. Before you start with Cloud Foundation, you need to sit down with your network guys, look at your physical network, understand your VLAN requirements, understand the MTU settings, understand how you're going to do route propagation, and then once that's all in place, then you're in good shape to go ahead and to get started with Cloud Foundation.
So I guess I've got two questions off of that. One for Kyle and probably then one for Broc. Obviously, it sounds like there's a bit of work. So we need, these 7 or 8 VLANs initially, maybe more if we're doing stretched. We need, an AS for BGP. We need to make sure MTUs are. It sounds like there's something that needs to be kind of documented or written down. Is there a form before, you start the install or PSO shows up to do the install that you should be filling out to make sure all those things are, the as-built design is done beforehand? Like, I know I personally in the lab just go YOLO and build stuff and kind of document it after the fact, but I assume in the real world you should be filling something out first and then going and making sure the deployment feeds off of that. Is there a form or a PDF somewhere I should go look for?
Yeah, so we have what's called the VMware Validated Solutions, and as part of that, we have what we call a designing and prep workbook, and it's essentially a spreadsheet where you can go in, has a number of tabs, and it outlines in great detail, and sometimes too much detail for people getting started, all the requirements. At the end of the day, what you really need is you need a JSON file that has all this information. We recognize that JSON's not all that easy to work with. So what we do have the planning and prep workbook, which is very detailed. A lot of our professional services people will use that, and it's good because you can share it with the customer. You can plan it out all before, like months before you get into your actual installation. You can actually have all this information. You can fill in all the values and the forms. And then if you're not wanting to get into the designing and prep workbook, you want something a little simpler, we do have a deployment parameters spreadsheet that you can download from the Broadcom software portal when you download Cloud Foundation. And that's kind of an abbreviated version of what are the network requirements, as well as what are your DNS requirements. We didn't talk about DNS, but of course you always have NTP, you always have DNS. We just kind of assume those things are there. And,
LDAP, auth, yeah. All the syslog, ideally,
Yeah, so all that stuff's going to be there, but we do have a spreadsheet that where you can go put all this information, including, what are your host names? What are you going to name your NSX managers? What are you going to name your vCenter servers? What are you going to name the SDC manager? And then the IPs you're going to assign, the VLANs you're going to assign. So there's a couple of different resources there. We use these workbooks or these if you want the detailed version, go look for the deployment parameter guide. If you want the short version, just go out to the Broadcom software portal and you'll see it there listed under the software downloads when you download the Cloud Builder OVA. And we use Excel, not because Excel is required, but because it makes it easy for you to view. You're not editing XML or JSON files, but we can also put in some checks. So if you have the wrong mask the wrong gateway with the subnet, it will kind of help you to make sure you get that good. And then when we deploy Cloud Foundation, we actually take the Excel and we convert it into a JSON and we use that to deploy.
Okay, so they build the JSON for me. Yeah, I'm allergic to writing JSON or YAML by myself. I need like a special tool. So, that's great. So, okay, so I take that as this is supposed to be built. So some of that's going to be existing services. I assume the product itself has some validation that, as I walk through the installer to check some of that, but also, and this may be a question for Broc, who sees where, maybe the design was there, the networks were typed in correctly, but maybe the network wasn't chiseled on the bottom, like the VLANs weren't created or the MTUs weren't. What are the things that we're going to catch with that? And maybe Broc can jump in also here, Kyle may know what SCC manager the install process is going to validate for you, but what are some of the top things you see go wrong, I guess, from Broc's side of people, not configuring those things, and how do you recommend people quickly troubleshoot that? What are those processes? And I know it may be VMK ping, it may be create a dummy VM. What is that?
I mean, those are all great troubleshooting steps, but if you're already at that point, like you're in a worse situation, right? Because you don't have the infrastructure to support like the connections. So what I like to say is the core services are what you're going to want to check. Those are things that these things need to communicate, right? Because you've got an SDC manager, you got a vCenter, you got an ESXi host, you got an SX manager. Those all communicate in different ways, and if they break DNS, NTP, certs, version issues, there are pre-checks in like NSX upgrades and stuff, and there's pre-checks that we're adding into. They're adding a bunch of them, so hopefully those will catch those. But if you don't set yourself up for success here by just making sure your DNS servers are good and making sure these communications are set up correctly, it's just all going to fall apart. And that's mostly what I recommend usually, is just get those core services up and running good, and then you have a much more likely chance of success.
Yeah, I'm having slight flashbacks. I once vMotioned a 911 system to a host that apparently the VLAN had not been correctly configured, and poof, it decided to disappear from the network. So it's good to hear that there are more pre-checks and things, but I'm curious, what are what are some of the most common, I guess, misconceptions between the documentation and the physical, and what are some common ones you see?
It's always DNS, right?
Yeah, it is. So like I just got off one this week. So they had documentation that said that these were cabled into this thing. They had a big Excel sheet. It said everything, all the host names and everything. But then when you actually looked at the actual switch, half the cluster wasn't even plugged in to the right thing. It was something else.
Okay, so look, wow, go look at VDS and link state, but
yeah, or CDP or LDP, and be like, did my network team actually do what they said they did?
I like that we're implicitly not trusting the networking team, which is my natural state. CDP, Cisco Discovery Protocol, LDP, Link Layer Discovery Protocol. What can I do with those to make sure things are documented as well? Like, what do they get me?
They get you like the MTU settings on the switch. They get you VLANs. We have observed IP ranges. We have a health check on DVS to check for VLANs and teaming policy, because people mess up teaming policy all the time. It can get you the switch port, the switch version, depending on what you send it. You can do the reverse. So even you can have ESXi send it to the switch, and then they can check on their end to see if they're actually plugged into the ESXi host name that they think they're connected to. It's just all mapping, and it's just really good practice to have that documented.
That sounds a lot better than driving into the data center physically and like physically following a cable. That sounds quite lovely. So yeah, let's make sure we turn. I know some security people were paranoid and would try to turn those things off, but I think it's required for RDMA and data center bridging now. So hopefully we can make sure that gets left on.
Oh, that's a whole nother conversation with RDMA.
RDMA will get its own episode. Don't you worry. Yeah. Stay tuned, listeners.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely want to save some time on the end for some of the lessons learned, some of the more maybe some more personal stories around some of the mistakes folks have made, so other folks can avoid said mistakes. But before we do, I know when we're talking about preparation, especially when we're talking about VMware Cloud Foundation, a lot of folks are going to be using the VCF import tool. And there have been some changes made to that as it pertains to networking. Kyle, maybe we can touch a little bit on those, maybe talk a little bit about vSphere distributed switch and some of the changes with LACP.
So we introduced the VCF import with 5.2, and prior to that, if anybody had worked with Cloud Foundation, they were very familiar with the cloud builder and this concept to bring up, and there was kind of the one way to get to VCF. But if you had existing vSphere environments running in your data center, you want to bring them into VCF. We didn't really have a way to do that, so we introduced this VCF import tool. And what's nice about the VCF import tool is it relaxes a lot of the requirements that were built into the cloud builder, built into the SDDC manager, and to include the ability to relax some of the requirements around the network and what we require from a network. It's important to keep in mind, though, that as we talk about the VCF import tool, we kind of have two scenarios here. We call them greenfield and brownfield. Greenfield, of course, is net new infrastructure that was deployed from the SDDC manager. And brownfield is those existing vSphere environments that you bring in to that environment. And because the rules are kind of a little bit different in terms of requirements around, if you want to deploy a new workload from the SDDC manager, do a greenfield, then some of the rules still apply around things like a dedicated VDS per cluster. You can't have LACP enabled and things like that. But when you do the VCF import, we're able to relax those because we're not doing automation to bring those in. We're just pulling those environments in. So with the VCF import, particularly with the latest version 5.2.1.1, and I have a blog out there. If you go to the Cloud Foundation blog, you can find it, where I just introduce one of the big ones was we now have support for being able to have a shared VDS across multiple clusters. So if you go out and you have a cluster, by default, we're going to have a dedicated VDS per cluster. But there were a lot of customers who in their existing environments for different use cases want to share those VDSs across those clusters. And that was a problem. So we relaxed that requirement. We now have support for that. And the other big one is LACP. A lot of customers use LACP in their environment. And when we would do the import, we had a guardrail where we would check. And if we see it, we would basically say, hey, you can't import this. But the customers said, hey, we're not going to change our network. We want to be able to continue to use this. So we said, okay, we'll relax that. So with the VCF import, you can now bring in those vSphere environments with LACP. You can bring in those vSphere environments that have shared VDSs, and you can bring those into Cloud Foundation. And it just makes it a lot easier to get started with Cloud Foundation, and a lot easier to work with your existing physical network without imposing a bunch of new requirements. So just basically, hey, you want to get on Cloud Foundation, you want to get there fast. We're trying to make it easy for you so you don't have to change any of the ways you're doing business. You can keep doing business the way you are, and you can modernize and get going with the private cloud.
Right on. And a link below for those watching the video to the blog that you're mentioning. But also, I'm curious, and this is up for discussion. I'd love to hear all of your opinions on this. But why do some folks choose to use just one VDS, and why do other folks decide to use multiple VDS? Is there a benefit? Is there something to consider?
Sure, I could start. By default, one of the things we really focus on with Cloud Foundation, and I've been working Cloud Foundation for years, and going all the way back to the beginning, one of our goals was to simplify. We want to kind of reduce the number of components, reduce the number of objects that have to be managed. And as part of that, we came up with this recommended topology of a single VDS with 2 NICs, and we put all of our networks on this one VDS. And that works great. And as we have higher speed NICs and things, that will work. But then customers would come to us and they would say, hey, I have a requirement from a security standpoint that I separate my management traffic from my storage traffic, or I have concerns about running overlay traffic and vSAN traffic on the same VDS. I want to put them on separate physical NICs. And so rather than try and argue with the customer about whether or not those requirements are valid, they're requirements, they have them. So we had to become more flexible. So as we've gone through, we've added support for multiple VDSs. We've added support for doing traffic separation in order to support those customers. So it's all about flexibility. It's about, hey, if you want to separate your vSAN traffic from your other traffic, we'll work with you. We'll enable that. If you want to separate your overlay traffic from your vSAN traffic, we'll do that. And so so there's a lot of use cases out there. And we support them all. But now if you're saying, hey, what is the recommended practice and how can I keep this as simple and how can I make this modular? We do have our VMware validated solutions. We do have our design guidance, and we do have a recommendation to say, hey, if you got 2, 40 gig or 100 gig NICs on each server, maybe you don't need to separate them. VLANs are pretty good with traffic isolation. You got the bandwidth. Keep it simple with a single VDS. But hey, if you come back and say, hey, I need to separate them, my requirements are I separate them, you can do that as well. So it's all about flexibility. But those are some of the reasons why customers will want to separate traffic types.
Absolutely. I always get in this conversation because they always call support and ask, what is the best practice, right? Like, what is the best optimal thing I can do? And it really just depends, because it's cost, it's redundancy, it's security. You have all of those options and manageability, right? So if you have over 70 hosts, maybe 1,000 hosts, all those factor in, because then the cost goes up, and then the security goes up, and then it's all different. But like, generally speaking, most everything is going to be basically configured. A network adapter is basically configured for general traffic. It's not going to handle large amounts of high.
I think Broc's network, since we're talking about networking, I think his network just died on him.
I think Broc needs 8 gigabit fiber.
That's pretty funny. Timing was hilarious.
Well, he is in Denver, so the bits have to go uphill. So
that's right.
probably slowing
I
down
think
because you got to
we're.
push the bits up.
You know, the
I
air
think
is
somewhere
the air is thinner up there.
Yeah, there you go.
Grotto up here. Sorry.
The Wi-Fi's have a harder time hopping.
Yeah,
so
the
there we
Wi-Fi
go.
has.
Yeah. It's that mile high. Bits got to go
Yeah.
up.
Well, yeah. So I was just going into all the costs, and the people want bandwidth, but they want security, and they want all of these things, and it's manageability with how many hosts you have. And in general, most of the time, these configurations that we recommend are just going to be basic. They're just for general traffic at general load at general usage. So if you're going to have customization that you're going to need, because you're going to throw a database on there, or throw 1,000 VMs at it, or a big, video server or webcams, I don't know. And then you're going to need to change the config, because that's higher traffic rate, that's more bandwidth, or CPU cost, or all these things come into play. So generally speaking, most things are general. So there's not a best practice for your environment, because you have your own unique environment, essentially.
Yeah, I would imagine with you working in support, you probably see a pretty large range of different environments, right? Like from the smaller network that might just have a couple of mail servers, and to maybe some of the more extreme scenarios.
I see everything. And so speaking from the customer perspective, they come at me with oh, I need to throw 1.5 million packets per second at this thing. By default, a VM is not going to do that. By default, most cards can't even do that out of the box. You're going to need to turn features on, like RSS, or get more queue pairing, or add CTX per dev to your VM to get those CPU cycles to actually perform like that. So I just recommend that a lot of vendors have those requirements on their documentation. So before you do the deployment, check those, and what are your requirements for how fast or how much this is going to go, because that's going to cause you to have a bad time way faster than just generally deploying.
Yeah, network IO control is good for doing some basic quality of service, but yeah, if I'm pushing 1 million packets, this is getting dedicated ports. So
in the latest versions of vSphere, with our DPU support, we now have ability to do some offloading onto the DPUs if you want to go that route as well. So
yeah, and that's going to be the next conversation this year. I feel I'm going to have a lot of talking about DPUs, ENS, RDMA, QoS, NIOC, all that kind of stuff, because people are pushing workloads way faster than they have ever done before that I've seen.
Yeah, and from a performance, but also from a security perspective, having that offloaded to a DPU is definitely something. It was a lot of conversations around that at Explore this year, and I think that's definitely going to be something that customers are talking to you next year about, Broc.
I think we need Broc to have an Explore session for 2025, extreme network configurations. I think that's going to be the session that's going to get accepted. So we'll go through what are the most extreme examples, and how to, because there are, like you mentioned, all these new fancy offloads and things to do, and they're unfortunately not all just check a box, although hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah,
we tend to try to make things easier.
Yeah, I think the last one I had was 8-port 100 gig pushing LACP to a PowerFlex that was doing 1 mil IOPS or something. It was absolutely absurd.
That's a perfect segue to the final segment of this episode, is the troubleshooting and lessons learned. And Kyle, feel free to jump in as well, because I know you definitely speak to a lot of customers. But Broc, I'm curious about your perspective in this regard. You deal with a lot of customers that are, they're calling you when things are, when there's some, I was going to say things are on fire, but that's probably not a relevant joke these days. But yeah, calling
especially if
you
they're in Los Angeles.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so, on a serious note, what are some of the more memorable experiences you've had as it pertains to people coming onto VCF and maybe not doing it right?
Like I said, the one previously there, packets per second stuff. We've had a lot of people just going in and say running really old versions, and when they go into VCF, their versions aren't up to the correct dates and stuff, and they're sitting on super old stuff, and it's VCF has version requirements, I believe, and a lot of those kind of things. And you're just not setting yourself up in the best situation to get those. And then, like I said, not designing and for your workload. And then they just throw all this at it. Core services are always a common thing. DNS, MTU, all that stuff.
What about physical network, like switches? Is there any?
So far, since John has done all those blog posts and we've been saying things about switches for a very long time. No longer that is actually the case. The most stuff I get physical now is like ACI and with NSX interrupt, because there's some settings you need to enable on the ACI to like not flap max and stuff, and so you get full outages. There's the switch. There's a no one right now where if you reboot an ACI switch, it takes like 7 minutes to bring a NIC
reload the config. Yeah, it brings
no,
link,
it's the
but
active
like the
thing.
configs. Oh yeah.
It's basically physical link stayed up without data path. So we have to go on our side and set the uplink failover to like 7 minutes, and then that's like, so it's just a lot of ACI stuff right now for physical switches and stuff because there's some interrupt and like I said, and config.
Do we need to make a cake and send it to Santa Clara and say please follow RFC, like, whatever, and maybe we can get that fixed? But
the big thing for me is I don't get really into the details of stuff, but when I'm doing like a customer POC, I've done a lot with like running Kubernetes on top of Cloud Foundation with the vSphere Kubernetes service, formerly known as the vSphere with Anzu. And one of the things that that service is a great service, and if you're going to have trouble getting that going, it's typically going to come to the networking and understanding how NSX works and tunnels and things like that. And the one thing I've learned is if the customer can't draw out on a whiteboard what their high-level architecture looks like, then there's no way they're going to implement it. If they don't understand the concept of uplinks, they don't understand where their VLANs are and how the packets are going to flow. And so a lot of times I get on and where the customer's trying to enable, like say Kubernetes, and they're saying, hey, my tunnels are done. I go, okay, well, what VLANs are you using? And they don't even know, or they just took the VLAN that they used last time. And so so it's kind of if you can't draw it, you're going to have a hard time implementing it. And then the other thing is, we've already touched on this, is you need to work with the network team. And you need to, trust and verify type thing. If the network team says, here's a VLAN, and you say, well, did you set the MTU to that to 1700? And they say, yes, well, let's verify that. Because when I get into the middle of a POC and find out that, no, it wasn't set to 1700, it was 1500, well, I just spent 2 days troubleshooting a tunnel issue to find out that the VLAN wasn't set correctly. So it's draw it out. It's verify your the network requirements that I talked about at the beginning, and just understand the topology. Look at those spreadsheets, the design prep guide, and kind of map all that out. A lot of times, I'm guilty of this as well. I get something new, I just jump right in. The instruction manual, the docs are to the side. I jump right in, and then I'm cussing and I'm getting frustrated because it's not working. And then I have to step back and say, okay, what have I done wrong? And then somebody comes in and says, well, right here on page 3, it told you should have done this. Oh, I didn't see that. So yeah. So just from a troubleshooting perspective, a lot of the troubleshooting is just going to be tied to being able to understand your topology and being able to understand, like John mentioned, do VMK pings with large packet sizes and make sure those packets are flowing. Look at those routing tables. I find a lot of times I'm helping customers troubleshoot BGP issues. Do they understand their ASN numbers and where they're at, where they're tied in? Do they have a password set? Do they not have a password set? Things like that. There's just a lot of things, but just be able to understand it. And I always start with, give me a diagram, show me what you're trying to do, what we're implementing in. And if they can't do that, then it's very hard.
That just because you tell your network team as well that I need this VLAN doesn't also mean that they're implementing that VLAN everywhere. Because with NSX and Federation and stuff, we are stretching multiple VLANs from multiple areas. So it's very common for, like, I'll tell a customer, like, hey, we need a VLAN for vMotion, right? They just go in and put it on the uplinks to the ESXi host, but don't do it to the VPC or the communications between the switches, between the racks. So now you have half vMotion. So, and then you test it and it works from switch side A up and down, but not A to B. So the only time it'll ever switch that is once you reboot. So then you'll wait about a year, do an upgrade, and then it'll go from A to B and actually break, and then you call me and say, hey, it's broken, it must be VMware. It's like, no, you just didn't implement the VLAN across all the switches. Like, it's a very common thing, actually.
Yeah, is that hopefully that's documented somewhere on a best practices guide.
I would much rather, though, that at least someone forgot to route vMotion and my vMotion fails than I vMotion something somewhere and the VLAN of the workload itself doesn't exist, which is why we invented NSX and overlays to help with that. But
yeah, I mean, one specific example that I run into a lot is with Cloud Foundation, and this is documented. We have a requirement that you have this concept of a tunnel endpoint, and we have host TEPs and we have edge TEPs. There's two separate VLANs, and they need to be routable. And oftentimes, we'll find that those aren't routable. And they need to be you need to be able to ping with large packet sizes and stuff, and so a lot of times you get in, and if I'm logging on to a customer's environment and I log on to NSX, I see the tunnels are down. I'm looking at MTUs and I'm looking at can the TEP networks talk. Those are the two things I'm looking for, and it's amazing how often to Broc's point, they've implemented the VLANs, but they didn't implement them enough, or they're not getting propagated in the routing tables, and they don't have the routing necessary. And and that's one that's fairly common that I see, is just verifying that routing with those large MTUs to get those packets through. And once you have it, it's great.
Do we have a way with Verni or something to deploy agents that can basically check end-to-end routing and health? Because I know Thousand Eyes can do that, and I've used it for that many ages ago. But is that something that we have in our suite, or is that like a NetOps? Is that maybe NetOps, like the CA software suite, or what?
Yeah, I think with the new VCF, they're implementing a bunch of health checks.
But I'm thinking something like you literally have agents dropped in networks, and then it visualizes the BGP health and shows you that end to end. But because I know like Thousand Eyes, you deploy OVAs everywhere, and then it just I actually did that in our R&D center up in Wenatchee, deployed them and was like, oh, look, this pod and this pod, something bad is happening between it. Please fix.
Well, I know in NSX now, we do have an MTU checker where if it detects the MTUs are off, it will kind of notify you. We also have trace flow in NSX, will allow you to do some basic packet flowing back and forth. And then as far as the Verni or the operations for networks, I think we're calling it nowadays. I don't have any experience with that. I would hope it's there, but I don't.
I thought Verni was mostly for layer 4 info and monitoring. It didn't have active agents. I think that maybe more of a CA NetOps or other network SolarWinds or Thousand Eyes or whatever that tooling is. I was just curious what direction people go in that way.
Well, yeah, to me, that's good stuff. I'm going to, for me, the takeaway obviously is before you do a move is to make sure you RTFM, read the fantastic manuals that we will list on the show notes of this podcast, and then make sure that your network is ready for a full migration. Any closing thoughts before we take off, gentlemen?
The one thing, I guess, the one closing thought I would say is when it comes to networking, I run into a lot of people who are trying to implement a modern private cloud on a network of the 80s. You can't modernize your data center, modernize and go to Cloud Foundation if you don't modernize your physical network. And so if I'm having conversations about, hey, can I do this on 1 gigabit NICs as opposed to 10 gigabit NICs? Usually those are home lab guys, and I get it. But we oftentimes will be focused on bringing in Cloud Foundation, and then we'll kind of peel back the layers and realize that this is an old network. And so remember the big picture. When you're modernizing your data center, you're going to private cloud. It's not about just bringing in new software. It's about, hey, if you're going to bring in new hardware, what about your switches? When's the last time they were upgraded? What do they need to refresh as well? And do you have the bandwidth on that physical network to be able to support what this new private cloud and these virtual networks are going to be driving when we start introducing things like Kubernetes and VMs working together? And so, just kind of that's just that thought of don't forget about the physical network. It's kind of like, I get my 66 Mustang, I paint it up, I get it looking all nice, but the tires are bald and I head down the road. I'm not going to get very far. You know what I mean?
I love analogies. We love analogies at support. I've got a story about that one too, because there was somebody that was doing a greenfield deployment, and they were deploying all of VCF and all that stuff, and into a new environment, new hardware, everything, right? And it was coming up with all bunch of errors and stuff. Well, it turns out where they were deploying from was a really bad infrastructure. It had DNS problems, like connection issues, like bad firewalls. We updated everything on the old cluster and fixed all the problems there with like drivers, firmware, and the switch firmware, and like firewall and DNS, and it fixed the deployment on the new side. We didn't even touch it, and it just all started to work. And it was like a month-old case. Like it was crazy.
Goodness. That is hilarious, and probably really common for what it's worth. Yeah. Very cool. Well, that's a good place to stop for now. Couple of notes before we take off, though. This is our first episode for 2025. But man, John, you and I finished the year pretty strong with lots of episodes in Las Vegas. Virtually Speaking podcast had a booth there. We interviewed a ton of folks. We also went to Barcelona, did the same thing. So there's a lot of great content, both on the VCF YouTube channel, but also on vspeakingpodcast.com. And yeah, we've got a whole year coming up of a lot of good content. One of the things I'm excited about, John, I haven't even mentioned this to you, but I don't know if you know this gentleman. He's actually pretty popular in the analyst world. He's done a lot of work with theCUBE. His name is David Lithicum. He's actually written a lot of good books. This one is an insider's guide to cloud computing. He's going to be coming on in about a month, and we're going to be talking to him about some really cool stuff as well. So we've got a pretty good schedule coming up this year. For those that are listening, as always, if you've got a good story or a topic that you want to hear about, let us know. Hit us up on the Twitters or even on Blue Sky now. Either way. But yeah, gentlemen, thank you so much for being the first episode for 2025, and enjoy the rest of your week.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. You too.